The rain pelted down hard that evening as Jacob pulled his collar up against the chill, stepping out of his car and glancing up at the tall, familiar building before him. He hadn't expected to be back here so soon, certainly not like this. The invitation from him, his former boss, had arrived a few days ago, casual but with just enough undertone to leave Jacob wondering. What could Grant possibly want after so much time had passed? He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. As he approached the sleek glass doors, memories flooded back. He and Grant had always shared a unique connection, an understanding that had crossed the usual boundaries of the workplace without ever stepping into anything more than friendship. Even now, as he was about to step into that beautiful townhouse, there was a knot in his stomach, a gnawing curiosity mixed with something else he couldn't quite define. The doorman nodded, recognizing Jacob from all those late nights when he'd stayed behind, working on the project that had marked the end of his time at Grant's firm. The high-end projects, the endless hours, the unsaid tension between them that Jacob tried his best to ignore, all those details crowded his mind now. He pushed them away as he rode the elevator up, watching the numbers slowly blink past. Finally, he was on Grant's floor. The soft lighting in the hallway cast a warm glow, and his footsteps echoed as he made his way to the door, stopping just short of knocking. Before he could overthink it, he raised his hand and gave 2 quick taps. Almost immediately, he heard movement from within. The door opened, and there he was. Grant's familiar face appeared, softened by the dim light spilling from his apartment, his usual suit replaced by something more casual, a deep gray sweater and black pants. Jacob couldn't help but notice how comfortable he looked, a stark contrast to the perfectly polished, always composed boss he remembered. "Jacob, you made it," Grant said, his voice warm, almost as though they were close friends instead of former employer and employee. "Of course," Jacob replied, forcing a smile. "It's good to see you, Grant." They exchanged a brief, almost awkward hug, a gesture that was as unexpected as the invitation itself. Grant stepped aside, gesturing for Jacob to come in. The interior was as meticulously decorated as he remembered, but tonight it felt more intimate. The lights were dimmed, the soft glow of lamps casting warm shadows across the spacious living room. Jacob felt an odd tension settle over him as he took in the scene, realizing they were very much alone. "Drink?" Grant offered, already heading to the small bar tucked away in the corner of the room. His tone was easy, familiar, and Jacob found himself nodding. "Yeah, a drink would be good." He took a seat on the leather couch, looking around at the tasteful decor and then back at Grant, who was pouring 2 glasses of something amber and expensive-looking. Grant returned, handing him a glass and sitting down a little too close enough that Jacob could feel the warmth radiating from him, catching the faintest hint of cologne. "To old friends," Grant said, raising his glass with a half-smile that had always been hard to read. "To old friends," Jacob replied, clinking his glass against Grant's. He took a sip, savoring the warmth of the liquor as it slid down his throat, calming his nerves slightly but doing nothing to ease the tension that hung in the air between them. For a while, they made small talk, about work, the industry, shared memories of late nights at the office, but there was an undercurrent to everything, an unspoken tension that grew with every passing moment. Jacob noticed how Grant's gaze lingered just a little too long, how his hand would rest a beat longer on his knee when he made a point. "Can I ask you something, Jacob?" Grant's voice cut through the conversation, a little lower, his eyes locked onto Jacob's with an intensity that made him pause mid-sip. "Of course," Jacob replied, his heartbeat picking up slightly. "Why did you leave?" Grant's gaze was unwavering, and Jacob could feel the weight of the question. It was something he had never answered in full. Jacob took a slow breath, feeling the familiar weight of that question settle between them. He hadn't expected Grant to bring it up, not after all this time. When he'd left the company, there were reasons he hadn't been willing to discuss, details he had buried so deep, in fact, that he hadn't thought about them until tonight, in this very room. It felt like the right thing to do," Jacob began, his voice steady, but he was keenly aware of how Grant was watching him, as though he could see right through the carefully constructed answer. Sometimes you just know when it's time to move on. Grant nodded, though he didn't look convinced. He leaned back on the couch, swirling his drink in one hand, his gaze sharp, assessing. But it never seemed like you wanted to, Jacob. You put everything into that job. Late nights, all those meetings. I mean, most people don't leave something like that behind without a good reason. Jacob shifted slightly, feeling the warmth from Grant's arm grazing against his. I don't know, he replied almost defensively. It was just complicated. Grant's eyes softened, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he held Jacob's gaze. It was complicated for me too, he said quietly, his voice laced with something Jacob couldn't quite place. Vulnerability, maybe, or regret. The room seemed to shrink as they sat there, both men aware that there was something unsaid between them, something they had never acknowledged out loud. Jacob could feel the pulse in his wrist quicken, could feel the way his breathing changed as he held Grant's gaze, waiting for him to say more, for him to close the small electrified distance between them. You know, Grant started, pausing to finish his drink, his gaze dropping to his empty glass before he looked back up, his eyes holding a raw intensity that Jacob hadn't seen before. There were times when I felt like we were more than just colleagues. The words hung in the air, heavy and pointed, and for a moment Jacob's mind went blank. He knew exactly what Grant meant. He had felt it too, those long nights working alone, the quiet, unspoken moments they had shared. But he had never dared to believe it could mean anything more. They had been bound by their professional roles, and Jacob had kept his distance, convincing himself that what he felt was nothing more than admiration. But now, sitting here with Grant's words lingering between them, he realized he could no longer deny what had once been hidden. Jacob swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. He started, his voice barely above a whisper. I felt it too. Grant's expression softened, his usual calm and collected demeanor slipping away, replaced by something vulnerable, something real. He reached out slowly, his hand resting on Jacob's knee, his touch warm and grounding. Then why didn't you say anything? Jacob laughed softly, more out of nervousness than humor. Because it didn't seem like something I could admit. You were my boss, Grant. It wasn't right, and I didn't want to make things complicated. A slow smile spread across Grant's face, his hand still resting on Jacob's knee, thumb tracing small circles that sent a shiver up Jacob's spine. Complicated, he repeated, leaning in closer, his face mere inches from Jacob's. It seems like we were both trying to avoid complicated, but maybe complicated isn't so bad. They were so close now that Jacob could feel Grant's breath against his skin, warm and steady. He could see the intensity in his eyes, the way his gaze dropped to Jacob's lips before returning to his eyes, unspoken desire flickering in that brief glance. Jacob's heart raced, every nerve in his body awake and alive, his mind flooded with memories of those late nights at the office, the times he had wanted to reach out, to close the distance, but had forced himself to hold back. And now, he didn't want to hold back anymore. Before he could second-guess himself, Jacob leaned forward, his hand reaching up to graze Grant's cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin under his fingertips. Their eyes met for a split second, and then, slowly, they closed the distance, their lips meeting in a kiss that was hesitant at first, testing, but quickly deepened, filled with all the unspoken words and hidden desires they had kept buried. The kiss was everything Jacob had imagined, and more. It was gentle yet intense, a rush of emotions he hadn't dared to feel. Grant's hands slid up to cradle the back of Jacob's neck, pulling him closer, deepening the kiss, and Jacob felt himself melt into the moment, all his defenses falling away. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Grant rested his forehead against Jacob's, a soft chuckle escaping his lips. "I never thought this would actually happen," he murmured, his voice low and rough. Jacob smiled, his hand still resting against Grant's cheek. "Me neither," he replied, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "But I'm glad it did." They sat there in the silence that followed, both feeling the weight of what had just happened, the significance of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The silence stretched between them, thick with the gravity of what had just unfolded. Jacob's fingers still lingered on Grant's cheek, as if grounding himself to the moment, making sure this wasn't some elaborate dream. The warmth of Grant's skin, the way his breath slowed, the slight upturn of his lips, all of it felt real, tangible, and suddenly, so inevitable. Grant pulled back slightly, his hand dropping to Jacob's, his thumb grazing the back of Jacob's knuckles with a quiet intimacy. "I never really stopped thinking about you, Jacob," he admitted, his voice softened, tinged with a vulnerability that Jacob wasn't used to seeing. Jacob's heart ached at the admission, a part of him both stunned and relieved to hear the words. All this time, he had thought he'd been the only one feeling this strange, forbidden pull. "It was the same for me," he whispered, his gaze dropping, almost embarrassed to be admitting it. "Leaving was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I thought it was the right one." Grant nodded slowly, his hand tightening around Jacob's. "It's funny, isn't it?" he murmured, a faint smile crossing his lips. "We both spent so much time hiding what we felt, pretending we were just colleagues." He chuckled, a dry sound laced with self-reflection. "All that time we spent in close quarters, the late nights, the glances we kept ignoring. I thought I was the only one feeling it." Jacob's cheeks warmed and he let out a soft, nervous laugh. "I think I was in denial half the time, convincing myself I was just being dramatic, that it was nothing but admiration." He hesitated, the words feeling raw on his tongue, but there was a strength in Grant's gaze that urged him on. "But it was more than that. It's always been more than that." Grant's expression softened further, his gaze fixed on Jacob with an intensity that made his heart pound. Without breaking eye contact, Grant leaned forward, brushing a gentle kiss to the corner of Jacob's mouth, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had held back. "Then maybe this is our second chance," he murmured against Jacob's skin, his lips warm and feather-light. Jacob shivered, the suggestion stirring something deep inside him. Second chances didn't come easily, and he knew how precious this moment was, how fragile. He wanted to say something, anything to capture the weight of it, but all he could manage was a nod, his voice lost in the rush of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. They stayed close, neither willing to let the other go, as if breaking contact might shatter the moment, dissolve it into the quiet, everyday world outside these walls. Jacob could feel his pulse race, each heartbeat resonating with the words he couldn't say aloud. And yet there was a tension still, an unspoken question hanging in the air. "What now?" Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. He didn't know what he was asking, exactly. Maybe he wasn't sure if this could work, or if they were simply caught in the heat of a moment that would fade once reality set in. Grant's hand drifted up to his shoulder, his thumb tracing gentle circles there. "We take it one step at a time," he replied, his voice steady, reassuring. "No expectations, no labels, just you and me, and if it works, then we'll make it work." Jacob's chest tightened, a strange sense of relief washing over him. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear those words until now. Just knowing that they didn't have to define anything, didn't have to explain or rush, was enough. Maybe this didn't have to be as complicated as they'd once feared. Their gazes met, a silent agreement settling between them. Jacob let his hand drop to Grant's shoulder, resting there, his fingers grazing the fabric of his sweater, the closeness feeling more natural than he would have thought possible. The warmth of Grant's presence, the solidity of his touch. It was grounding, familiar, like coming home. "You know," Grant began, his voice barely above a murmur. "When you left, I thought maybe I'd just imagined it all, that maybe what I felt was one-sided or wishful thinking." Jacob felt a pang of guilt at that, a rush of empathy. He had left because he thought it was best for both of them, that he could just move on. But standing here, he knew the truth. He had left because he'd been afraid of what he felt, of what it could mean for both their careers, their reputations. But now, that fear seemed distant, insignificant. "I'm sorry," Jacob replied, his voice thick with sincerity. "I should have, I don't know, been more honest. I thought I was protecting us, but maybe I was just hiding." Grant's hand slipped to the back of Jacob's neck, fingers brushing his hair in a comforting gesture. "We're here now," he said softly, his voice a steadying anchor amidst the turbulence of emotions swirling between them. "And I think that's all that matters." Jacob felt a quiet surge of courage rise within him, and he leaned forward, pressing a lingering kiss to Grant's lips, allowing himself, for the first time, to savor the moment, to let go of all the inhibitions he'd clung to for so long. He could feel Grant respond, his hand tightening on Jacob's shoulder, pulling him closer, the quiet intimacy of the gesture filling the space with an intensity that left him breathless. The kiss deepened, growing slower, more deliberate, each movement filled with a yearning that had been stifled, restrained for far too long. Grant's hands moved to his waist, guiding him closer until there was no distance left between them, the boundaries of personal space dissolving in the heat of their shared breaths. Finally, they pulled back, their foreheads resting together as they caught their breath, both smiling in quiet disbelief. It felt surreal, as though they were caught in a pocket of time that didn't belong to the outside world, a space that was theirs alone. Grant took a breath, looking down as if composing himself. "I haven't felt like this in a long time," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's different with you." Jacob's heart fluttered at the words, warmth spreading through him in a way he couldn't quite describe. He felt a sense of belonging, a calm certainty that settled over him, wrapping around him like a blanket. It was terrifying, in a way. How right this felt, how quickly the world outside had faded away, leaving just the two of them, locked in a moment that felt both fragile and infinite. They sat there, no words needed, each breath in sync with the other, both content to let the silence speak for them. The quiet lingered between them, thick with the weight of emotions neither had voiced but both understood. Sitting side by side, their hands still intertwined, they seemed almost hesitant to move, as if even the slightest shift could break the spell cast between them. For the first time, the tension that had once felt like an insurmountable wall seemed like a thread connecting them, something they both wanted to nurture rather than avoid. Grant glanced down, running his thumb gently across the back of Jacob's hand, the soft, repetitive motion surprisingly intimate. "It's strange," he said softly, almost as if to himself. "All those times we worked late, stayed behind after everyone else left. I kept wondering if you'd pick up on what I was feeling." Jacob's breath caught, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I think I did, but I kept pushing it away. You were my boss, and I didn't want to make things complicated." Grant chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "There's that word again. Complicated. We've both spent so much time avoiding it." He paused, lifting his gaze to meet Jacob's. "Maybe we're overthinking what could be really simple." Jacob's smile faded, replaced by a thoughtful look. "But what if we're not? I mean, we're here now, and it's—" He faltered, searching for the right words. "It's amazing. But I don't want to pretend that the real world doesn't exist outside these walls. Once we step out of here, people will see. They'll talk." Grant's grip tightened slightly, grounding him. "Jacob," he said firmly, "I don't care what anyone thinks." He took a deep breath, letting his hand settle over Jacob's, reassuring. "I didn't realize just how much I was missing this. Missing you. and I'm not going to let some fleeting opinions change that. Jacob felt a rush of gratitude, warmth flooding his chest. The uncertainty of it all lingered, yes, but with Grant beside him, that fear felt bearable, almost insignificant. "I just want us to be real," he admitted, his voice softening, without pretending or hiding. "I want to be able to just be with you." The vulnerability in his voice brought a new softness to Grant's expression. "Then let's start here," he replied, his voice a quiet promise. "Here, where it's just us." With that, he leaned in, capturing Jacob's lips in a kiss that was deeper, filled with unspoken understanding and the need to feel each other, to solidify what had been left unsaid for far too long. Jacob felt a shiver as Grant's hands moved up his back, pulling him closer, their bodies pressed together in a way that felt as natural as breathing. They moved together, slowly at first, each touch careful and deliberate, as if savoring each other's presence for the first time. Jacob's fingers tangled in Grant's hair, feeling the soft strands beneath his fingertips, the warmth of his body filling the spaces where they connected. Every touch, every brush of skin, every sigh shared in the quiet was another step past all the unspoken boundaries, a surrender to the moment they had both wanted and feared. As the minutes slipped by, they became lost in each other, the outside world fading into a distant memory, and, for the first time, Jacob felt free. Free of hesitation, of restraint, of the need to pretend he didn't want this. With Grant, he could let himself go, let himself feel everything he'd once locked away. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Grant's forehead rested gently against Jacob's, a soft smile playing at the corners of his lips. "This doesn't feel complicated," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet contentment. "It feels right." Jacob laughed softly, nodding, a sense of peace settling over him. "I never thought it could be this simple," he admitted, running his fingers over Grant's shoulder, the touch light, almost absent-minded. "But you're right. It just fits." They stayed like that for a long while, wrapped in each other's arms, the night stretching before them like an unspoken promise. The rain continued to patter softly against the windows, the dim lights casting a warm glow across the room, as if the universe itself were cocooning them in its quiet approval. Finally, Grant leaned back, his expression a mixture of humor and relief. "You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that," he said, his voice warm with a newfound ease. Jacob chuckled, feeling a flush rise in his cheeks. "I think I might have some idea," he replied, eyes glinting with a hint of playfulness. Grant took his hand, his thumb brushing over Jacob's knuckles, his expression turning serious once more. "We'll take this one day at a time, Jacob," he promised, his voice a steady anchor amidst the swirl of emotions between them. "There's no rush, no pressure. Just you and me, as we are." Jacob nodded, his heart swelling with an unexpected sense of contentment. They didn't need to define anything, to make any grand plans or commitments. In that moment, just being there with Grant was enough. They sat together, still and content, the weight of the past slipping away as they leaned into the quiet intimacy of the present. Grant's fingers laced with Jacob's, warm and grounding, and Jacob found himself wishing the moment could stretch on forever, free from complications, free from the outside world. But eventually, reality began to settle in around them, pressing in at the edges of their little bubble of peace. Jacob felt it first, a reminder of everything waiting for him outside of this room, the life he'd built, the choices he'd made. It was a subtle, nagging sensation, one he tried to push away, but he knew he couldn't ignore it forever. Grant seemed to sense the shift in Jacob's demeanor, his gaze searching Jacob's face with a quiet understanding. "You're thinking about it, aren't you?" he asked gently, his tone free of accusation, only empathy. Jacob nodded slowly, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. I don't want to lose this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm scared of what comes next. How do we even begin to make this work?" Grant took a slow, steadying breath, his grip on Jacob's hand tightening. "We don't have to have all the answers right now," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "This doesn't have to be everything or nothing. It can just be us, figuring things out as we go." The simplicity of the suggestion eased some of Jacob's fears, but the uncertainty still loomed. He wanted to believe that they could keep this, protected from everything that threatened to pull them apart, but he knew how messy life could get, how fragile even the strongest bonds could be. What if we end up hurting each other? Jacob asked, his voice tinged with vulnerability, voicing the fear that had been lurking in the back of his mind all along. Grant's gaze softened, his thumb brushing gently over Jacob's hand in a soothing gesture. "Then we deal with it. We're both grown men. We've been through enough to know that pain is part of the process. But I'm willing to take that risk, if you are." The words hung in the air, a challenge, a promise, and Jacob felt something shift inside him, a quiet resolve taking root. Maybe it wouldn't be easy. Maybe there would be times when it would feel like too much, but the thought of walking away from this, from Grant, was unbearable. "I am," Jacob replied, his voice steady, the weight of his words resonating with finality. "I'm willing." Grant's face broke into a slow, genuine smile, relief and joy mingling in his expression. He leaned forward, pressing a tender kiss to Jacob's forehead, his hand cupping Jacob's face with a gentleness that made Jacob's chest ache. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other's warmth, the silence around them filled with unspoken promises. Jacob didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a quiet sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they could make this work. As the night wore on, they talked, laughed, shared stories and confessions they'd held close for years, their connection deepening with each passing moment. It was a night neither of them would forget, a beginning they hadn't dared to hope for, a promise of something that might just be worth fighting for. When dawn finally began to break, casting a soft glow across the room, Jacob felt a bittersweet pang. He knew the real world awaited, that the challenges they'd face were still very real, but with Grant beside him, he felt ready to face them. They stood together by the window, watching the sunrise, Grant's arm around Jacob's shoulders, Jacob's head resting against Grant's. It was a quiet, perfect moment, one that needed no words. "Whatever happens," Grant murmured softly, his voice steady, "we'll face it together." Jacob smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and gratitude. He reached up, pressing a soft kiss to Grant's cheek, a silent agreement. Together, they turned to face the new day, ready to take on whatever lay ahead, knowing that no matter what came next, they would always have this, each other.